Thanks, everyone. I'm Jennifer Bradley. I'm the director of the Aspen Institute Center for Urban Innovation. I'm grateful that you've joined us today to learn more about new federal actions, from really high-profile bills like the $1.9 trillion American Rescue Plan to executive orders and regulatory changes and how they can be used to support an inclusive recovery in cities. Just a few housekeeping notes. This event is being recorded and it will be shared on our YouTube channel and over various social media. As most of you are doing, we ask that you update your display name to be your full name and your organization so we understand the mix of sectors that we have with us today. We're reserving the last section of the event for audience questions. We're excited that this can be kind of a peer-to-peer conversation. We ask that you drop your questions in the chat and I'll read them out to panelists at the end. If you want a specific to answer your question, please note that. We found that this system helps us to address more questions than any other system that we've come up with over the last year. Unfortunately, we still won't get to every question. This webinar is a project of the Shared Prosperity Partnership. And to explain a little bit more about the partnership and introduce our speakers, I'll turn it over to our moderator, Chantel Rush. Chantel is Managing Director of the Kresge Foundation's American Cities Program. Her work advances the Foundation's efforts to catalyze more effective community and economic development practice that expands opportunities for people with low incomes in American cities. Chantel, over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm here on behalf of the Shared Prosperity Partnership. The Shared Prosperity Partnership is a collaboration of the Brookings Metropolitan Policy Program, the Aspen Institute Center for Urban Innovation, the Urban Institute, and the Kresge Foundation. Our goal is to leverage the resources and technical assistance from these organizations and provide that support to local leaders who are advancing equitable action and inclusive recovery in cities. We know that the resources coming to cities and the resources that have come to cities so far through the stimulus are critical levers to make a difference in our communities. And we think that there are things to be learned from the past, a distribution of resources, from the current dollars that are coming out, and a way to think about how to leverage these resources to make a better future. So we're going to have both a couple of panel discussion and a couple of presentations today. The presentations will frame out a bit more about the executive actions that are happening at the moment, as well as federal legislation and how it might impact cities. And then we'll go into a panel discussion with local leaders who are thinking about how they're actually using these resources today. So I'd like to start with a presentation from Solomon Greene. Solomon is a senior fellow at the Research to Action Lab and the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute. His research focuses on fair and affordable housing, how land use laws and housing policy can improve access to opportunity, and how data and technology support inclusive urban development. Over to you, Solomon.
Great. Well, good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where you're located. Thank you so much for joining us. Really excited to have this opportunity to discuss with you the roles that the federal government has played and can play to support inclusive and equitable recovery in the cities you live and work in. As Chantel mentioned and Jennifer introduced, there have already been several federal actions that we want to kind of start by leveling the playing field for a discussion with some of our local partners and for the discussion later. And my job is to introduce you all to the executive action side of the equation. And Alan will be talking about legislation. So I'm talking more on policy. He'll be sharing the important money and resources. So in the first 2 months since taking office, President Biden has already taken several actions to support inclusive recovery in cities. I show them on this slide in as a timeline. These are just, these include actions directly from the White House, executive orders, presidential memorandum, and less formal interagency requests. And this timeline shows the top 9, starting from, by my judgment, starting from Inauguration Day and extending through the end of February. We don't have time to go into all 9 of these executive actions, and I want to use my time to focus on some big themes and what to expect next. So Beth will drop into the chat. Oh, does she already done that or is starting to do that? The full list of executive actions and links where you can find the full text of all of them. And you're welcome to drop into chat any questions you may have about any of these, and I'll answer them in chat, or we can come back to them during the discussion. For now, I just want to preview that they include actions related to the following 4 topics. The first is supporting a robust and equitable response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And you see on here the January 21st and January 22nd executive orders related to ensuring an equitable pandemic response and recovery and economic relief related to the pandemic. Another theme is advancing racial equity, starting with on day 1, on Inauguration Day, an executive order broadly advancing racial equity and providing support for what the order calls underserved communities throughout the federal government. We could talk a little bit more about that broad executive order, but racial equity, as I'll come back to in a minute, really runs through virtually all of these executive actions. The third big theme is stabilizing housing and revitalizing neighborhoods that have suffered from generations of disinvestment. And we see this in the extension of the foreclosure and eviction moratorium, the presidential memorandum on redressing our nation's and the federal government's history of discriminatory housing, and even the climate crisis executive order includes the Environmental Justice 40 initiative, where 40% of investments in clean energy, transit, infrastructure, workforce, and housing are intended to go to disadvantaged communities. Lastly, you'll see some orders in here repealing Trump-era executive orders that antagonize cities and actually impeded progress on advancing equity goals, including penalizing what are called sanctuary cities and labeling and penalizing cities as anarchist cities. So won't spend a lot of time on those, but that was the those executive orders from the Trump administration have been reversed. Next slide, please. Oh. Great. So I do want to just say a little bit about cross-cutting themes that run throughout these executive actions. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, racial equity is a really strong one. And there is a racial equity executive order, which covers data. It covers, taking a close look at policies, evaluating policies across the federal government for racial impact. But each of these executive orders has an element of racial equity in it. And I want to say there are actually 3 different parts to the racial equity themes that run throughout these executive orders. One is the recognition of structural racism and systemic racism and the role that the federal government has played in creating the disparities along lines of race across policy areas, across outcomes. And just that recognition, and it's so pronounced in the housing executive order on redressing the harms of past federal policies, just acknowledging the role that the federal government has played is pretty momentous in these executive orders. They're also signaling to agencies to play a stronger role in advancing racial equity, whether that's through fair housing and civil rights enforcement, or through taking a close look at how they spend their money and design their programs. And then last is there is also direct action that some of these racial equity orders are requiring, such as revisiting regulations and preparing action plans. The second big theme is leveraging the pandemic response to achieve an inclusive recovery. While many of these executive orders focus on the immediacy of the current crisis, recognizing how it doesn't affect all communities equally, they also talk about adopting equitable responses so that we pull ourselves out of this current pandemic and its economic fallout and in a more inclusive and equitable way, the Build Back Better theme. I mentioned reversing Trump policies that obstructed local progress towards equity goals. But I also think not just reversing those policies, but restoring the federal-local partnership and providing data and resources so that local governments and local leaders can actually achieve their equity goals. And lastly, I think all of these executive orders adopt a whole of government approach. They all relate to more than one agency and have some element of asking agencies to collaborate, to break down silos, to share data, develop joint plans. Some of them also actually create interagency task forces, such as the Climate Executive Order and the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Executive Order. Next slide. So I just want to say what we can expect looking ahead. And here I'm going to encroach a bit on Alan's topic and maybe help tee up his presentation, because this includes not just what we can expect with executive actions, but also in terms of big legislative pushes. So I do think from the White House, we'll continue to see an emphasis on the four big themes of the campaign and the transition. COVID-19, a rapid, effective, and equitable COVID-19 public health response, inclusive economic recovery and rebuilding the middle class, advancing racial equity in everything the federal government does, and climate mitigation and adaptation. I also think we're going to see major investments in housing. In particular, there's renewed attention in expanding and improving the Housing Choice Voucher Program. We're likely to see major investments in transportation and infrastructure with an emphasis on job creation, green energy, broadband, and climate. Major investments in the workforce, including job training, reskilling, and improving workplace standards. And finally, relaunching and improving interagency neighborhood reinvestment initiatives and place-based initiatives. Some of these we saw and many of you worked on during the Obama administration. And I think the current administration is learning from those efforts, like strong cities, strong communities, sustainable communities, promised neighborhoods, and figuring out not just how to bring them back, but improve upon them. I think that's it for now, and I'm going to turn it over to Alan to take us over to Congress.
Thanks, Solomon. Hey, everybody. I'm Alan Berby from the Metropolitan Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, and I am going to talk to you a little bit about primarily the American Rescue Plan Act, which was just enacted about just a few days ago, particularly the provisions of interest in the act for local leaders who are going to receive and allocate many of these resources. And some of you may be deep in this already, know lots of details. Others of you might just be learning about this, so forgive me if I go either too fast or too slow for you. And towards the end, I'll say just a little bit about the next large package, which Solomon was just alluding to, the so-called Build Back Better plan. That will likely be introduced by President Biden in April in an address to a joint session of Congress. So what is in the American Rescue Plan Act? So the majority of spending in this $1.9 trillion plan is in the form of expanded benefits to individuals, such as the stimulus checks that we've heard a lot about, short-term expansions to the child and earned income tax credits, and then continued federal supplements to unemployment insurance benefits. About $750 billion, or 40% of the bill, provides aid, both general aid and specific aid that's delivered through state, local, and tribal governments. And the categories of that aid are in the right-hand side of the table here, and these are what I'll step through in a bit more detail. So first, The most prominent sort of discretionary part of the package is the $350 billion in state and local fiscal aid. The $220 billion in resources to states are allocated mostly based on the state's share of unemployed persons in the fourth quarter of 2020, October to December. There are greatly expanded the resources for cities and counties in this package relative to the CARES Act from last year, which only provided direct grants to local governments that had populations of at least 500,000. So this time around, cities that are CDBG entitlement cities, that is typically with populations of 50,000 and above, are going to receive funding using the HUD CDBG block grant formula, which is based on population, poverty, and housing instability. Smaller cities will receive resources on a per capita basis, those that are not CDBG eligible. And then counties, so the funding is split evenly between cities and counties will receive their funds largely on a per capita basis. So a couple of differences from the CARES Act funding I think are worth noting here. First, the funds can be used to backfill lost revenue in contrast to CARES funding. The first tranche of funding will flow relatively quickly. So 50% of the funding will be coming to state and local governments within the next 60 days. And then the deadline to spend the funds is quite long, until the end of 2024. So there's a first tranche coming in the next 60 days, 50%. And then the second 50% will flow in about 1 year's time. State, city, and county capacity to use these funds for new spending, I want to emphasize, is going to depend in part on the size of their allocation relative to the revenue losses that they have experienced during the pandemic. So just to pick a couple of examples, last month, the city of Fresno, hey Gretchen, announced it faced a $31 million budget deficit this fiscal year. The National League of Cities estimates that the American Rescue Plan will provide possibly $88 million in fiscal relief to the city this year. So that it may be the case that Fresno has the ability to invest in some new critical areas. You might contrast that with Birmingham, hello JW, where they have a $63 million projected budget deficit this year, and that might eat up the vast majority of their expected $74 million in ARP aid in the coming days. Okay, second category, schools, colleges, childcare. School funding, there's more money in this package to local school districts than in past relief packages. It's generally intended to help upgrade systems and classrooms to support the safe return of students, to help them hire and rehire educators and support staff, and to make up for learning losses that many students have faced during a pandemic classroom year. Higher education also slated to receive significant support, $40 billion, and that's largely going to be allocated, as is the case with K through 12, in relation to their pre-pandemic enrollment of lower income students in the higher ed case, those who are on Pell Grants. And finally, definitely worth noting, childcare is getting a massive boost over the next few years, both through greater subsidies to families from the Child Care Development Fund, as well as direct grants to providers themselves that will run through states, $24 billion in new resources there for states. Next category, transit and businesses. Transit agencies are receiving $30 billion from the package. That's roughly equivalent to what they received last year when their ridership plummeted and operating revenues went way, way down. As the economy reopens, as riders return, this aid is essentially buying the agencies some time to restructure their operations in response to what in some cases might be a longer term reduction in demand. Most of the business aid, $29 billion of the total $39 billion, is in a new program that the Small Business Administration will administer for restaurants to cover their payroll and to backfill for their revenue losses during the pandemic. Additionally, this part of the package also includes a small plus up to the Paycheck Protection Program, advanced loan payments for small businesses in hard-hit communities, and actually a small new grant program for what they call Community Navigator nonprofits that help small businesses access these different programs. Final big category, the profile here, housing. The majority of new housing aid, about 21 of the $39 billion, comes through the Emergency Rental Assistance Program that's allocated to states, cities, and counties on a per capita basis for them to assist low-income and at-risk renters. There's other aid in the package, though, targeted particularly at the homeless through the home program funding, and to those at risk of homelessness through emergency housing voucher aid. Those each receive $5 billion in the package. Interestingly, the home aid will allow communities to acquire commercial property like hotels and motels for use as shelter, affordable housing, or supportive housing. Okay, so that's the American Rescue Plan Act. In the coming month, as I noted at the top, President Biden and Congress are likely to begin work on an ambitious investment plan under the heading of Build Back Better. Shown here is this sort of ambitious scope that was suggested in the president's campaign proposal. Solomon alluded to many of these categories in his remarks. It's unclear as yet whether it's going to proceed at these magnitudes or under all of these categories, or whether it might, at least in the first instance, be more narrowly focused on infrastructure and competitiveness items. And then, of course, what moderate Democrats might push for in terms of pay-fors for all of these items too. In all likelihood, Congress is going to need to use budget reconciliation rules once again to pass the plan with a simple majority in the Senate, and that's going to place some strictures on what the package can contain. But if a package of any significant size is enacted, we could see the confluence of those investments here and those in the second tranche of the American Rescue Plan in FY22 that may enable state and local leaders to pursue more transformative investments. So just a few parting thoughts I hope will connect to the panel discussion. I think it's important for places to understand their local fiscal baseline, which is going to help dictate the availability of more flexible dollars to deploy at the local level. Many of the dollars are going to flow through similar channels as in the CARES Act, so being aware of what worked and what didn't work and adapting accordingly is going to be crucial. And then finally, I think identifying ways that this year and next that the flexible portion of those dollars can support efforts that have the potential to enhance racial equity, geographic equity by either supporting intermediaries that create opportunity for Black and Brown communities, and or by supporting place-based efforts that bring together investments in a range of different assets for low-income communities. I think there's definitely opportunity here, and look forward to hearing from our panelists about how they're seeing it in their places. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Alan. It's a complicated amount of resources, a complicated number of moving parts. So I'm excited to speak with our local panelists to learn more about how they're thinking about using these resources. I'm going to now turn it over to our panelists. I'm going to moderate a brief discussion, and after that, we hope to leave plenty of time for your questions around the American Rescue Act and anything else happening. We have three amazing panelists with us today. The first is Ianna Kachoris. She is the Senior Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Chicago Community Trust. She leads the Trust's local, state, and federal policy strategies. We're also joined by Paul Young, the Director of the Division of Housing and Community Development for the City of Memphis. He coordinates community economic development projects. I should say his department and he coordinate community and economic development projects and initiatives throughout Memphis. And there was some exciting news that came out today about Paul's new role coming up. So congratulations, Paul. And then finally, Bradford Davy is the Director of Regional Engagement for the Fund for Our Economic Future in Cleveland, where his role is to spread the fund's growth and opportunity framework across the region. So we've got a lot to talk about. I'd like to start, I think, with what happened with the CARES Act. We're not starting with the American Rescue Plan from scratch. There were one-time resources that were distributed that have given us some insight into how to best use this kind of stimulus going forward. I wonder if I might start with Paul, who might share a little bit about what was learned in Memphis from CARES Act relief and how that might impact how we think about the rescue dollars going forward.
Yeah, I would say that for us, the CARES Act really gave us, it was a game changer for the way we think about how we provide services in the city of Memphis. We've had an eviction issue in our community for many years. The number of evictions in our community is really, really high, but it was the urgency of the COVID crisis and the resources that we had through the CARES Act, specifically those Treasury dollars that came directly to the city, that allowed us, to the city and county, I should say, Shelby County, we have dual government here. We used $2 million to establish an eviction settlement fund where we were able to pair volunteer attorneys with people that were facing evictions. And we were able, with that $2 million, to stave off evictions for 1,100 people. And we also were able to identify over 500 cases that should not have been in the court anyway because they were covered under the eviction moratorium. And so for us, it was really a testament to why we need to make sure that people go into these situations represented. And so as we're looking at some of the newer funds that are coming through, we're working in that aspect of having representation for folks that are facing evictions. And, you know, we're also using other dollars for things like improving transitional housing opportunities. We had a church that had this rehabilitation center that they could not get off the ground. They were trying to do like a nursing center or something like that. And they just didn't quite have, and this was pre-pandemic, they didn't have the operating plan to really make it work, but our division had been working with them. When the pandemic hit, we paired them with a group called Room in the Inn, which is a national organization that serves homeless individuals and families. And so now that facility, due to some of the CARES funds, that facility has been transitioned into a respite care facility so that those homeless individuals leaving the hospitals that are well enough to be out of the hospital, but not well enough to be on the streets, now have an opportunity to stay in that space. So, you know, it's opportunities like that that's gotten us to think out of the box and think much more collaboratively about how we serve the people in our community.
Yes, and so it sounds like there are some innovations in both like almost application processes and triage and program delivery. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, there's also been some increased collaboration among city and county government.
Yeah, absolutely. So one that, and this was not CARES Act, this was the one that, the second bill that passed, I don't know all the names, but the one that passed in December with those emergency rental assistance dollars. I've been amazed at what we've been able to create, and it was on the heels of the CARES Act. We had built collaborations with nonprofits and with Shelby County government, which thankfully we have a really good relationship with Shelby County because my sister, my biological sister, is the director of Shelby County Community Services, which has managed their portion of the funds. And so we put our full 28 million collectively, 19 for the city, 9 from the county. We put that together to create an emergency rental program where we have one application where you can apply online, and we are funding various nonprofit agencies, and Shelby County is actually doing the staffing and processing of checks. We're really thinking about how we can use these funds because we've never had this much money going towards this purpose. How can we use this as a game changer for our industry so that we can serve people better on the back end? And how can this be life-changing for the people that we're serving? We are able to pay up to 12 months of rental assistance right now. So 12 months is a significant amount of support that can be provided to families. And so we're thinking about that as we are structuring the program. And with the additional dollars that was just spoke about coming down, we're going to use these same structures to put these dollars out and hopefully help many more people in our community.
Thanks, Paul. It's clear you have been quite busy. I think, you know, both Bradford and Ianna, you're also thinking about how to use these resources going forward and how to think about them, not just to create short-term and medium-term improvements, but also how to leverage them over the longer term. I wonder if maybe we could start with Bradford, if you might share a little bit about how you're thinking about that in Northeast Ohio.
Yeah, sure. It's great to be with everyone today. You know, you mentioned it earlier, and it was in Paul's comments. The latest stimulus bill combined with the 2 previous stimulus represents for Cleveland, the largest positive exogenous shock we've seen in half a century. In our examination, Akron receiving 153 million, Cleveland 541 million, Youngstown 89 million. These are huge numbers. And you know, like Paul said, we haven't seen that kind of capital. And so, but what we also know is that a bunch of money flowing into cities without active shaping and preparation is really a recipe for protecting and reinforcing inequality, given that our nation's current structures provide the easiest path for capitals to flow to traditional, well-established, majority-led institutions, right? And so if we really want to disrupt that cycle, right, and create equitable outcomes, we have to think about our role at the local level in two really distinct ways, right? Shaping and preparation, right? Shaping is the activities that communities take on to understand how to distribute care dollars. How do we target them? How do we become more equitable? This is exciting work, but at the end of the day, it is by its nature reactionary, right? So if we think about shaping activities, there's really three, right? There's leveraging existing local resources. An example of that in Cleveland was the Urban League had a successful revolving loan program with no defaults. And so they wanted to continue that. And when there was CARES money available, it provided this opportunity to do a larger fund over a larger footprint. The tricky part was some of the EDA rules that said we couldn't focus on particular communities and it was too narrow. And so we worked locally to shape a proposal that worked within those guidelines. We weren't successful due to some technicalities, but we have been asked to resubmit. The other in the shaping category is this idea of platform building. How do we build on the established civic infrastructure, particularly with high performing intermediaries and sector partners that allow us to really accelerate the strategies rather than just sort of act on these narrow interventions, right? And one of the interesting, I think, platform opportunities that's emerging is with this $7.7 billion available to hire new healthcare workers, right? And if we hire these, if we think about this only to administer new vaccines, we're really missing something here, right? Platform building encourages us to utilize the expertise of our local workforce practitioners in the network to upskill and retrain residents for permanent jobs rather than a temporary search. If we consider this an on-ramp to a career in health sciences, you know, we don't squander this opportunity to build back better, right? And then I would just finally say, you know, we also have this supplementing, right? This idea of adding additions and enhancements to local institutions to fill the gap that improve federal support. And so this is where we see a lot of the small business stabilization funds. In Cuyahoga County, one was put together by the county, and then there was also a rapid response fund put together by the Cleveland Foundation, which focused particularly on nonprofits. And so, you know, if we kind of wrap our arms around this idea of shaping, I think we get a little bit closer to those equitable outcomes that we want to see. But I will end with this, right? Shaping is sort of the sexy stuff. It's the projects we write op-eds about. It's the interventions that politicians put in their stump speeches. For my foundation colleagues on the phone today, it's moving money to mission, right? And all of these things are really critical, and they've by and large staved off economic collapse. Important. But unless we really think about the long-term planning that we can do through sector partnerships or SEDS creations, we're really missing a key opportunity here.
Wonderful. This is bringing up all kinds of questions for me, like, you know, given the financial status of the cities you mentioned, you know, how much of the resources are really, you know, open to be leveraged versus how much are going to be needed for other shortfalls and sort of long-standing infrastructure that's been allowed to depreciate in some ways over time. Ianna, you're thinking a lot about how community can help influence and inform these dollars. Curious what you would want to add to the conversation on this point.
Yeah, so we've been spending a lot of time. So as a community foundation for the Chicago region, we have been really critical in helping to build partnerships with our local United Way and others in the immediate COVID response in terms of providing relief dollars, making sure that the early CARES Act money was going to where those resources were most needed, working in partnership with our county and our city. And we've now pivoted to be much more focused towards the recovery. So we had this Chicago COVID Response Fund, and now we're shifting towards to say, we know we're going to be in this period of needing to focus on relief for a little bit longer, but how do we prepare for an inclusive and equitable recovery, and doing it so in a way that really centers the communities that have historically been left behind in prior recoveries. And we have, the trust has, recently focused its efforts on closing the racial and ethnic wealth gap. And so we ourselves have been doing a lot of work. We, of course, adapted our strategies to be responsive in this moment, but what are the structures, where are we best positioned as a community foundation to help bring together multi-sector partners, folks from the public sector and the private sector and from community, those nonprofits who are working deeply in community, and also centering community voice and sort of laying the foundation in terms of how do we implement those things that Bradford was just talking about. And so we have created a new initiative called We Rise Together, which is very intentionally thinking about how do we bring these multi-sector partners together? What are the levers we have in each of those sectors to kind of lay that foundation, leverage existing efforts that exist in community, investing in those efforts, so the civic infrastructure that Bradford was just describing, in the infrastructure of our city and our county to be able to be responsive and do the work and absorb these resources and get out. And then thinking about what are sort of the systemic transformations we need to think about. So we've just hired an executive director. Sorry for the children running in the background. We're focusing that effort on three critical things. One is how do we increase employment? How do we strengthen small business? And how do we spur neighborhood investment? And we know there's a lot that undergirds all of that. And so it's not meant to exclude some of the community stabilizing investments, sort of, the rental assistance, et cetera, et cetera. But what are those opportunities that we have to focus on those three things? But in doing so, what are the structures that we need to create? We have to put those communities at the center, and having deep conversations with nonprofits that are serving community to hear what are those policy priorities, what are those intervention priorities that folks want to see invested in. And I can just say we recently had a readout from some of those community interviews, and some of the top priorities are the ones that we are all talking about, and where the resources are coming: housing, broadband, small business investment, and that sort of direct cash assistance support that the ARPA is bringing additional resources to. And so we're trying to create that mechanism and that broader effort that brings people together and brings people to the table who haven't historically been in conversation with each other, whether it's community, the business sector, and the public sector, to really help shape where additional grant dollars that we may be able to channel and invest through a grant making initiative, but also what are some of the business sector approaches that need to change? Hearing from employers, but also workers, about what are those supports that they need to be able to fully participate in a recovery, and what are those business practices that they can commit to that center racial equity. And it isn't just often about dollars, but it's like, how do we change what we're doing? And so how does the business sector come to the table for that? And then the public sector playing a critical role with that, and saying, we have these federal resources that are coming. Yes, we're dealing with budget deficits in Chicago and Illinois. it's a longstanding challenge, but how do we take these resources and bring them to bear and in partnership and leveraging these other efforts? So we're trying to create those tables, working groups that can bring all of these different resources, perspectives, ideas together and actually set us on a path as additional resources come down the pike, that we have the place to channel, to shape and channel those opportunities.
Thank you. So, a few questions arise for me from this. You've got this kind of large spigot of capital coming from the federal government, and then you've got Ianna, you're talking, about these tables at the community level that could influence or inform how those dollars flow. And there's just so much space in between those two things. So I'm curious if we could talk a little bit more about like the sequencing of this. So Ianna, I'd love to hear a little bit more about like, what's the timing and the sequencing for these tables, and how are they going to be able to inform the dollars that are coming now? And then Paul and Bradford, I'm wondering a little bit more about who really has to collaborate to get these dollars out the door in a way that's equitable. There's so many different actors, and without the specificity, it's a bit confusing about what really needs to happen at the local level. Maybe we could start with Ianna.
Sure. So in terms of timeline, I think we've been in conversation with the folks at SB2 for a little while about this effort and how do we shape it and frame it and get it underway. And so we're just at the point, so we've done these community interviews and focus groups. We have hired an executive director. We hope for these tables to start convening in the next month, so that we can really drill down what are the opportunities to leverage, what are some of the resources that need to be deployed to support the public sector to receive and invest. We've been having conversations with the city that some of the structures that they established for the housing assistance are actually may not work with the way that the new rental housing provisions have been put in place. And so it's actually more restrictive, but still, how do we meet those needs? So with the early dollars that the city was able to deploy on rental assistance, they were able to give that agnostic of immigration status. With these new resources, they may not be able to do that. So that partnership that they had entered into with the Family Independence Initiative to get those dollars to folks for rental support, they're not going to be able to leverage that. And so how do we support that? So creating those spaces for those conversations to start to happen we're just laying that, putting that in place. So it's, we know we need to move quickly, but we also want to be deliberate and planful about how do we do that. But, we're at the point where we're ready to kind of jump in. We've been in the strategy development, so those 3 areas. We've really been in that space for a long time. I'm doing a market map of who's doing what are in these various areas, and really understanding who needs to be at those tables and where those opportunities are to continue to further shape those interventions and then policy longer term.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Paul and Bradford, anything that the audience should really know when it comes to sort of who really needs to collaborate differently to make these dollars the most impactful over the longer term?
Yeah, I'll start. I think that the natural connection points for support in the communities have to be a part of this collaboration. And what I mean by that, we have an agency called Metropolitan Interfaith Association. That's MIFA, as we refer to it locally. And they are the hub of support for families that are experiencing crisis, whether you have food insecurity or you need housing. That is the place that you go. And so we had to have them as a part of the collaboration because that's already an entry point. Our local United Way is an entry point. And so what we tried to do was fold in those natural entry points and try to leverage everyone's specialty. And so MIFA specializes in homelessness and supporting those families. But we have a group like United Housing, which does housing counseling. And so we've made housing counseling a priority for those that are receiving emergency rental assistance. And so that's the bailiwick in which they play. And so the other thing that I would say is really important And it's not necessarily about collaboration, but it's maintaining enough flexibility as you're operating this program so you can adjust over time. My sister likes to say we're building this plane while we're flying it. And the other thing the other quote that I took from my boss is, we can't let great be the enemy of good. So with these programs, we have to get something that's good enough to get the money out on the streets to help people, but just know that we can adjust over time and make sure that we are creating a program that even after, and I saw this question in the chat, or this note in the chat about how endowments can help, even after this influx of capital is gone, you have a structure where it doesn't matter the source of the funds. If you have dollars, you have a structure that can operate, and that's where endowments and foundations and other sources of funds can come into play.
Awesome. We're in just a second. We're going to turn it over to Q&A because there's so many great questions in the chat. I've been trying to read them while I'm moderating, but it's difficult. But so Bradford, anything you'd add before we go to Q&A?
I would only say that two things since we opened the door to quotes. Most of our challenges come from the fact that we're not proximate to problems, right? And so at a high level, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that organizations that are on the front line of this are closer to the work. And two is that we have to be active participants in our own deliverance here. Everyone needs to be involved. And I think that there's nowhere that has been clearer than in the PPP work. Hypothetically, everyone was supposed to be able to receive PPP, right, in the first round. We saw that didn't happen. So the second round, CDFIs were enlisted to get closer to the problem. In the third round, I might suggest that we need to think about how we can get technical assistance providers to get involved in the recovery, because one of the examples is structured bankruptcy, right? As companies are thinking about the challenges on their books, just like people are underbanked, people are underlawyered, right? And we really need to make sure that there's technical assistance at the local level, at the ground level, to make sure that businesses come out of this prepared to continue to do business either in the same form or in different ones.
Perfect. Yeah, we saw that with the first round of PPP for sure. And in Detroit and other cities that Kresge works in, we're trying to figure out that puzzle, and it's can always be improved. So with that, Jennifer, would you like to guide us through the Q&A?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Chantel and panelists. I think that was a great understanding of the opportunity and the need to create different systems and collaborations and ways of behaving in order to get truly different results. One of the questions, and if you look in the chat, there's been a lot of talk about how much flexibility, how the federal government might structure things. So one of the questions from Dominic Robinson of CenterState CEO in Syracuse, he says, I'm curious if the administration is considering how infrastructure investments and economic investments will coincide with their racial and geographic equity agenda. Will projects in distressed communities that benefit low and middle income residents be prioritized, for example? Solomon, do you have any insights on that? Right, you mentioned that there's a lot of interagency whole of government approach. Is the federal government going to spend kind of through the lens of EJ 40 or through the lens of the executive order on equity?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that I don't know whether I have not actually heard whether any of the current stimulus is going to be EJ 40 is going to apply. That actually hadn't occurred to me yet. I think the executive order is a little bit more, has a longer horizon. It says it instructs agencies to start looking at implementing the environmental justice 40 initiative over a longer time horizon. Sorry, I have a garbage truck going by, so if that blocks the sound, I apologize. I think most of that's going to happen through guidance, but as I also, because to the extent it wasn't in the legislation, and you could look, piece by piece at the legislation. So I know in the housing context, there was an explicit emphasis using the housing dollars in hardest hit communities. There's an emergency voucher program, which there's expectations that it's being used for very low income families, lower income than would normally qualify for the voucher program or at greater eviction risk. So you could look at the legislation and see where the legislation includes kind of deeper targeting, more equitable parameters. A lot of that's going to happen through guidance, but I want to also emphasize what I put in chat in response to Simeon and now to Dominic's question as well. There was a typo there, but I think it's true in response to both questions that what you can expect is the federal government to actually leave a lot of discretion up to states and localities. And so the work really happens, is going to happen at the state and local level to make sure that all of the funds across programs are distributed equitably. I don't know if Alan has other thoughts or others on the panel or on the call in response to that. It's a great question.
Not for me. I thought that was well said, Solomon.
So Alan, I will direct this to you and then I'll turn it to the panel. Bethia and Annika in the chat have been talking about an opportunity to leverage resources. Bethia talked about the need to get different municipalities to collaborate right across municipal lines. Annika talked about this being an opportunity to leverage private resources. There are numerous efforts from public, private, and microfinance organizations separately. Alan, right, Brookings Metro program, you think about this a lot. How are these either cross-border or cross-jurisdictional collaborations? Are there pockets of money that could foster them? Are there good examples? And then I'll also turn to the panelists to answer this question, because I think it's really important, because not everybody has one sibling working in city government and one sibling working in county government where this stuff can just happen, like Memphis and Shelby County.
Right. Yes, but to cut to the chase, like that's probably it strikes me as some of the lower hanging fruit in terms of sort of cross-jurisdictional collaboration can happen, at the city and county margin, because they're both, significant recipients of the local aid dollars. Of course, cities and counties have different functions and are, backfilling their budget holes for different of those functions. But yeah, there's I think it was just the motivation for the aid was fill your budget holes. Okay, where do budget holes emerge? Okay, they emerge at the jurisdictional level. So unlike, if the emphasis were, actually stimulus, you might have seen a stronger emphasis on sort of bigger regional plays. And it may be that in the coming Build Back Better legislation, we see more of that, and we should see more of that. And I would, I think I and my Brookings colleagues and Solomon and his urban colleagues will be looking for chances to emphasize that. But I would love to hear more from, I think, Memphis, Shelby County, and Cleveland, Cuyahoga County too, about, how they have found, either this time around or sort of looking back to CARES, the opportunities for city-county collaboration.
So Paul, do you want to take that, and then I'll check in with Bradford?
Yeah, I mean, to the point about not having a sister and brother, I know that that's not the case everywhere, but I do think that there is a very clear interest in making sure that we get the most out of these funds. And so I would encourage municipalities and counties to really think about how you can leverage these to create some support systems that will live long beyond this injection of capital. One thing that I guess, and this is not answering the question, but I'm just going to say it. One thing that I think we can do, or we should think about as municipalities, is how can these dollars go towards improving some of our most lingering issues? And for Memphis, one of our lingering issues is the quality of our housing stock. So we're putting a lot of dollars into rental support and paying rent, but we're paying rent on pretty crappy units. And so what we have done as a part of ERA, for instance, is we have worked in a randomized inspection. So if the landlord accepts the funds, then we can randomly inspect the property to ensure that it's up to code. And with that, we're also going to be taking some of the CDBG dollars and trying to create some pots of funds where if you're a landlord and you don't actually have the dollars to make those improvements, you can tap into those dollars. So layering impact. And I think if you can get multiple jurisdictions to think like that and be on the same page, you can really have a tremendous impact on your respective communities.
Great. Bradford, turning over to you. And also if you want to incorporate some of the things that's just emerging in the chat, again, from Anika and Simeon, about making sure that the dollars actually get into the hands of the people who are most in need, as opposed to this kind of siphoning off of dollars through institutions, through, again, the people who usually get and distribute and benefit from this money. That is a big topic. I wouldn't ask if I didn't think you were more than capable of knocking it out of the park.
Yeah, well, I'll try. At the first point, I think the opportunity for collaboration is really around some of this competitive money. For instance, there's 3.6, Alan Solomon, let me know, 3.6 billion from the USDA to build up food supply chains. And so in a place like Cleveland, where there's this ability to really leverage some of our food innovations, how do we build up a cluster that allows us to grow in that way? And as it relates to being neighborhood centric, and making sure that it gets in the hands of the people that need it, the fund has previously supported some work around the Central Kitchen, which is a food incubator that's specifically targeting plant-based proteins in Black and brown neighborhoods, and trying to really seed and scale minority food entrepreneurs. And so how do we connect these really real small businesses to the competitive grants that are probably only going to be able to be realized through those bigger sort of intermediary city-county collaborations? And then I'll just say that the other competitive place where we can think about this is the $1 billion that are available for 10 cities to establish tech innovation hubs. And so, if we can get really aligned across cities and counties to design those places and compete for dollars, we can scale new innovations in neighborhoods that have drastically needed them.
Great. Really quick over to you, Ianna, and then Chantel to wrap up.
Yeah, I wanted to just add a quick thought on this, because, Chicago is the biggest city in Cook County, and there's a lot of overlap. We have several municipalities in our region, as the Brookings Metro folks know well. It adds a layer of complexity, but I will say that, as part of this initiative, we have both the city and the county sitting at the table on the steering committee of entities. And what we're starting to hear a lot of as these new dollars come in are requests for supporting the city or county infrastructure to do this work. So even in the earlier stages, we partnered with the county on their small business grant program, where they actually granted the money to the trust, and we got it out because we could get it out quickly directly to small businesses, but also to those intermediaries providing technical assistance. Sometimes that's appropriate, other times it's appropriate, and as we continue to hear, is who is at the city with the fiscal strain that the city and the county have been under. They're not always staffed to be able to do the work of designing the programs to get the money out. And so we're getting a lot of requests to support staff in addition to the partnerships to get the money out. So as we think about how do we do that for both our city and our county, serving a large millions of folks in both of those jurisdictions, we really want to make sure we can help support that.
Great. I wish we could address the incredibly rich conversation that's developing in the chat, but unfortunately we can't. Perhaps we will have another time to come together. Chantel, can you give us some words to close out?
Well, I just thank everyone for joining us. Thank our panelists. Also thank Alan. and Solomon. It sounds like there is a ton of work to do, and in a few months we'll know even more about how to do this work more equitably and inclusively. So perhaps some of the questions in the chat could be addressed in a future webinar like this. So thank you all so much, and I'm wishing everyone on the call a lot of success and good luck for the work that they'll be doing over the next few months.